Hello, good morning and welcome. It's Thursday, June the 19th. Overnight, the Wall Street Journal reported that President Trump has approved US attack plans for Iran, but was going to hold off on the final order for them to go ahead to see if Tehran would abandon its nuclear program. But I'm told there was not a flurry of activity overnight in number 10, suggesting that we are still more than a few hours of actual US involvement. My name is Sam Coates of Sky News.
And I'm Anne McElvoy from Politico, and this is Politics at Sam and Anne's, the podcast that gives you everything you need to know about the day ahead in British politics in 20 minutes. And what a day. The news that President Trump has told aides he okayed a bombing raid on Iran also is reported by CBS News. At the time of speaking, there's no official confirmation, but then the concept of official confirmation seems to be a slightly wandery one in US politics at the moment, Sam.
So really the question for us on this podcast now is, how does Britain respond to the awfully fast-moving events? Keir Starmer flew back yesterday from the G7 in Canada to take personal charge of what's going on, chairing a meeting of the government's emergency Cobra committee as big decisions loom on how far and how close the UK works with the US in the coming days. There could be further Cobra meetings today, but number 10 at time of recording simply said they didn't know. Keir Starmer, who is after all an unexpected foreign policy prime minister, now sees himself being dragged into the kind of conflict which in the past he would never wanted to have involved himself.
We also have some breaking news about Britain's involvement, hot foot from his meetings with Marco Rubio in Washington today. The Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, tomorrow will have meetings with his Iranian counterpart as part of a diplomatic push to prevent the war. The foreign ministers of Germany, France, Britain and the EU are all holding nuclear talks with the Iranians in Geneva. And the news that the Foreign Secretary is our representative coming straight there from Washington shows, I think, how seriously this is being taken.
Wow, that is just a really important moment tomorrow. And David Lammy at the helm of these discussions directly with Iran, having flown directly from the US, means that he is an utterly pivotal figure in what's going to happen in the next 48 hours. I suppose the fact that that meeting tomorrow is taking place, Anne, means the whole world is being given some breathing space, because surely nothing will now happen before that meeting has concluded and the consequences of that meeting have been digested. So we've got 24, 36 hours for everyone to draw breath, plan and debate what happens next. And by the way, that chimes with Bloomberg's reporting overnight. They are saying that if US bombs do go ahead, then the strikes will be this weekend. Now, clearly, some things are already in train in the US. Top leaders of a handful of federal agencies have been getting ready for an attack, according to Bloomberg, according to their sources. But to be honest, the best assessment of where we are right now actually comes from Donald Trump himself. He just said, and he always has the right soundbite for the moment, I'm finding, whether you like it or not. Donald Trump says, I may do it, I may not do it.
I think the question there is he applying the uncertainty principle there to unsettle Tehran, or does he genuinely not know yet what he's going to do? And that keeps everyone on tenterhooks. And today's key discussion, what is Keir Starmer's Attorney General, Richard Hermer, going to advise the Prime Minister to do in the event of further attacks sponsored from the US or supported by the US? Let's discuss that in a moment.
But today is only Thursday, and even just waiting a few days to strike gives the Iranian leaders a possible off-ramp. Yes, it does depend what Iran does next as much as anything. And effectively what's happening is the world and the US is giving Iran an off-ramp, a ramp. What the Iranians have to do is to demonstrate that they are willing to give up some uranium enrichment capabilities. That is what Donald Trump is demanding, and they need to show that they do this. They are prepared to do this. Yesterday, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi said that his country remained committed to diplomacy and had never sought and would never seek nuclear weapons. But whether that's actually true, and more importantly, whether the US actually believe him, well, that We just don't know, and we'll have to wait and find out in the coming days.
It was only a week ago that Donald Trump himself was urging diplomatic talks to reach a disarmament deal there with Iran over nukes, and talking up the prospect, as he tends to do, of a deal being the best way through things. So the big question is, what's changed other than the conduct of the conflict so far, and that battering of Iran targets by Israeli military? Now, Trump's rhetoric does seem to have shifted significantly, and perhaps that is because allies have impressed upon him that Iran is close to obtaining a nuclear weapon, though just how close is a matter of debate. And one big finger here, Sam, we know holds a lot of sway is, of course, Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister. And he's been urging the US to take the moment to strike the Fordo nuclear enrichment facility. He needs the US bunker buster bombs to penetrate, to do that. And there are US voices too now beginning to chime in and say this could be the right moment to do so. Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, a central voice, urging the president to consider military action. Trump, we hear, has had multiple calls with Graham, and the kind of line of thought there is, well, they had the chance for diplomacy. They didn't take it. It's been a miscalculation. Let's now do it with full shock and awe. And Graham said on Wednesday of Iran, the sooner we end this threat to mankind, the better. I also know from my own previous reporting that Trump, in his advisory circle, has a number of Iran hawks. Up to now, he's tended to balance them out with people more concerned about Russia and China. But is this the moment when he turns his attention formally to Iran?
The other thing that the British Embassy in Washington is going to have to monitor, by the way, I think Peter Mandelson's in the UK at the moment, but the rest of the embassy is going to have to monitor is what members of the wider MAGA movement is doing, because they are appealing to Donald Trump in the other direction. Figures like Steve Bannon making clear that they think that Donald Trump ran on a ticket of being a president who ends the US involvement in world wars, not get deeper into them. So Donald Trump torn in two directions, and what happens will partly depend on that. So we need to be monitoring that as well. But what lies behind the change of stance? Is this apparent public statement by the White House that Iran is much closer than was previously acknowledged to obtaining nuclear weapons? Now, whether or not this is true, as you just touched on, is absolutely critical on both sides of the Atlantic. It's a sort of key part of the UK discussions as well. So do we in Britain and our intelligence services and our foreign service share the view with the US that Iran is actively working and getting close towards producing nukes, which appears to be the justification for US involvement in bombing Iran if that goes ahead? And is that an assessment that the UK shares independently? Well, at time of typing, it's not clear that it is. And such an assessment would be absolutely legally as well as politically key to what the UK thinks is justified, and therefore what it gives permission to do and what kind of military action it may authorise and take part in.
I think we're going to need to hear a lot more about the British position on that in the coming days. David Lammy set out the position at the moment on Iran's nuclear program on Monday, when he told MPs that the International Atomic Energy Agency, the body that oversees compliance and non-compliance on nuclear development, that they passed a non-compliance resolution against Iran, the first time that they've done so in about 14 years. And the Director General's report details a failure to declare nuclear materials. It says Iran is the only state without nuclear weapons accumulating uranium at such dangerously high levels, and the pace of that has picked up in recent months and over the last couple of years, and its enriched stockpile is now 40 times the limit in the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the old GCPOA, of course, which was abandoned and left on the sidelines a number of years ago, and which Donald Trump certainly wanted to get away from. The only question is, Sam, that the wording, I'm interested in what you make of this. So looking it up, the IAEA, she's very careful in its wording, says that Iran is less than satisfactory in its compliance in a number of areas. Well, that's obviously a strong criticism, but it doesn't feel at that level like it provides you with the raw material, so to speak, to say, well, clearly you've got to take out the nuclear facilities then. And it will remind, I'm sure we're going to go on to some discussion about it, will remind some people about what do you think is evidence before you go into a conflict or go to war in a tinderbox situation in order to contain something, or have you kind of overdone that reasoning?
100%. It sounds like you and I have both gone to the IEA website and looked up last week's report. And it's crystal clear. Look, Iran are definitely not in compliance. Indeed, what they've done, and the IEA report spells this out, is that they have removed all the independent monitoring equipment about their nuclear program. So the IEA, very clear, we just can't tell what's going on. But also, it's what it doesn't say. It does not say and does not use the kind of language that you would get from Lindsey Graham, who's advising Donald Trump, that Iran is on the brink of having nuclear weapons, which is the key to the argument that the US might use in order to justify bombing Iran. And it's in that gap, I think, that there's a very awkward kind of difference of position, but potentially between the UK and the US. Keir Starmer was asked in interviews on Monday whether or not he thinks that Iran is on the brink of getting nuclear weapons. And he simply said, well, I can't tell you what our intelligence assessment is on this. I suspect he's doing that because we don't have the evidence that they are on the brink of obtaining nuclear weapons, but he doesn't want to say so publicly because that would be to create a division between the UK and the US at this sensitive time, at this moment where David Lammy is acting as a bit of a bridge between the Americans with the meeting with Marco Rubio and the Iranians who he's seeing tomorrow. But it is key to what we think that we could do.
I think the messaging around how you read that information is going to be so critical, isn't it, to the transatlantic relationship? And that's a big consideration for Keir Starmer as he holds his meetings about what to do today. Now, there are two big claims in the media this morning around that. The first in the Times is that Britain could support the US strike. British military sources believe the US may want to use Diego Garcia as a staging post for any US operation on Iran. Britain would need to give permission to Washington to do so. And the second is questions that are raised in The Spectator and on the front of the Telegraph and Times too, about what exactly the Attorney General Richard Hermer is advising would be legal in these circumstances. Strong vibes there. Will remind people of the advice of the then Attorney General Peter Goldsmith during the Iraq War, the difficult position in which the original advice put Tony Blair on his decisions on how far to go into that conflict, but also then subsequently had great difficulty for Lord Goldsmith in justifying it. So this really puts Richard Hermer, I think, fully kind of in the bullseye of a kind of difficult legal piece of advice to have to give. Now, the Times is suggesting that the UK could limit its involvement to defensive support, which I have to say, putting my metaphorical former war correspondent boots on here, I think that's always the holding pattern argument until you've decided what to do. It's all defensive. Well, kind of everything's defensive. You can move lots of material and people about and claim it's defensive, but at some point you are then involved in the conflict, and it's judging that that's, I think, going to be the big test for Keir Starmer.
That's right. My US side Sky colleague Mark Stone also hearing that the government's chief legal advisor raised questions over whether or not Israel's actions in the last few days in Iran have been lawful. And of course, if Richard Hermer deems Israel's actions in Iran to be unlawful, then the UK is restricted in its ability to help defend Israel or support the United States with planned attacks on Iran. I think some Tories have noted that the UK has been less involved militarily in defending, even in defending Israel in the last few days from Iranian attacks than it was when Rishi Sunak was Prime Minister. And people are joining a dotted line between that and the legal advice that Richard Hermer may or may not do. Ultimately, we don't know. It's important to say that all legal advice for anybody who's ever consulted a lawyer, people will be familiar that lawyers do issue warnings and cautions almost automatically in any, and there is a balance of chance when coming to assess things against legal tests. But ultimately, the decisions have to be made by the Prime Minister. So it seems to me like a slam dunk, automatic. You could have guessed from space that some warnings would be issued by Richard Hermer. The real question for me is not, did Richard Hermer issue warnings? Because of course he did. It's how much attention does Keir Starmer pay to them? Because you can elevate them as one of the most important things, or you can deprioritize them. So it's not Richard Hermer's judgment, but Keir Starmer's judgment that is key. And let's just outline why it's key. So the US has to ask the UK if it is to use the Diego Garcia sort of military base, a US military base, but on territory sort of controlled still by Britain, if it's going to use that base in to join Israel's war. American B-52 bombers and jets are already deployed to Diego Garcia. However, according to Debbie Haynes, my colleague, she says that the conversations haven't yet taken place about whether or not B-2 stealth bombers are also pre-positioned there. These are the US warplanes that have the bunker-busting bombs that are sort of powerful enough to reach Iran's Fordow nuclear site, which is built deep into a mission. Now, as you were touching on earlier, under long-standing rules, the UK must grant permission to the US to use Diego Garcia for such military operations. If the White House needs Britain's green light to be able to launch these things against Iran, my starting point, Anne, is that it seems inconceivable that the UK would say no to the US, because for all the autonomy that we can pretend to ourselves that we have, I think realpolitik means that we wouldn't block a bombing raid by the US on Iran ourselves.
I think you're right. I do think because of the way the Trump administration makes its case, this is not the situation that you had where you in Iraq. I mean, whatever then transpired, but Britain was at least brought into the decision-making process. The relationship was tight and close and pretty reliable. Yo Blair, as you infamously, remember George Bush. That was the sort of level of familiarity in the relationship. It's much more transactional. It's much more testy at times with Donald Trump. So I think a lot has to proceed from the argument from defence. We can absolutely make that argument about ramping up in Cyprus, etc., where we have exposure because we have troops there. But you're absolutely, I think you've got your finger in the really difficult pain point here, which is like, on what grounds then are you don't in realpolitik want to stop the Americans using Diego Garcia? I think that's right, but I think, particularly given what happened, the huge controversy over legal advice on Iraq, Keir Starmer, who's after all a lawyer, first and foremost a lawyer himself, has been a lawyer and a prosecutor much longer than he's been a prime minister or even a politician. Yeah, I think he will find it hard just to push aside legal advice, which is what some people would do in this situation. But that's just a hunch. I think he will find that he wants as much legal defence as possible, but in the end, it is a political decision. And that context, seems to me, is changing quite fast. David Lammy, for instance, is back on the front lines of the relationship. He's been perhaps not so prominent in transatlantic dealings of late. Well, he is now, because he's having talks with Marco Rubio. We reflected that at the top of the podcast. But there's also a lot of tension there about that decision recently for Britain to sanction far-right Israeli cabinet ministers. David Lammy was strong in doing that. He, I think, felt that it was the right thing to do. He was back on the airwaves about it a lot, but also I think it was a bit of party management for Labour, frankly, over Gaza. And please do something that tells Israel that they've gone too far on the settlements in this case. But as a message, that now I think is turning around a bit as David Lammy sort of comes back into the frame as the Foreign Secretary, dealing with a quite difficult US administration on Diego Garcia, because the US is simply going to expect that it happens.
Right. We are out of time almost. That was the alarm. Two little domestic notes. Today was meant to be the day of the government's infrastructure plan. A day where yet more billions of money is doled out for building things. I think the news agenda might mean that doesn't happen. What's the point in spending billions if you're not going to get any credit for it? So I think we're starting to see the government agenda shift because of events in the Middle East. At midday today, there's an important moment. The Bank of England announced the Monetary Policy Committee's deliberates the outcome of the Monetary Policy Committee's deliberations on interest rates. We are actually expecting that they will be held rather than reduced from the current 4.25%. There are just fears of an energy price shock stemming from the war that's going on in the Middle East, on top of inflation cooling only slightly. So Danish had been boasting that that interest rates have come down at every single meeting. I think that run of better news is going to come to a halt. And if I'm being honest, when we come back on Monday morning, I have no idea whether or not the US will have bombed Iran. This is a forward-looking podcast. I surrender. The pace of global events is too uncertain, too unknowable. But stay glued to Sky News, stay glued to Politico over the weekend, because big things are clearly going to happen. And we will bring it all back home to domestic politics on Monday morning when we see each other then.
And Sam, because it's such a globally important topic, I just have to say, as we say goodbye, that there is breaking news. A request to bring cats into the Houses of Parliament to control the rodent problem has been rejected. Labour peer proposed that. Senior Deputy Speaker says it would be too dangerous for the cats. Oh dear, so no cats and still rats around the parliamentary estate. If you work there, sorry, going to have to go catch them yourself.
I can't bring Bob into work. He's quite happy interrupting it here. I will see you again on Monday morning. Thank you very much indeed to Anne.
Eventful week ahead. See you, Sam.
Hello, I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Every weekday morning, we bring you the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast.
It's 15 minutes to get your day started with the top global news and business stories.
We have 3,000 journalists around the world to tell you what happened and why it matters.
These days, a lot can change overnight.
So join us every weekday morning for the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast.
Subscribe today to get us in your feed by 7 a.m.